Hi, Barry. Firstly, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's really good to see you. How's everything going?
Yeah, great, Pete. It's really nice to see you as well. Things are going very well in Qatar, and I'm looking forward to chatting through some aspects about leadership for the next hour or so. So yeah, all good.
Brilliant. Well, let's jump straight in. What I would really like to do is just hear a little bit about your story, so that the listeners understand where you've come from, a little bit about your journey, what you're doing now, and maybe if you can talk about it a little bit from a leadership perspective as well. So not just kind of a history of your jobs, but how your leadership journey has grown through your professional journey.
Sure, yeah, and I think it's probably wise to pick up this story around Loughborough, which is probably where the employment starts, and it's the involvement with the squads and the performance element of my career. And strength and conditioning is my background. So the first type of leadership aspects, and if we frame leadership in my head quite simply as essentially you're helping the people or the organization basically be at its best form. You're trying to help the people, the processes, and everything else. Um, as a coach, then I worked with Loughborough University and then with what was known as the EIS at that time, working up with different levels of athletes. So UKA and British swimming were big ones, but also women's FA, women's rugby, other sports. And as the groups became higher performance, the interaction with more personnel, with sports sciences, with performance directors, head coaches, becomes more and more succinct, and you have to balance obviously the opinions of multiple people. So that was a period of about 14 years in Loughborough, kind of three Olympic cycles plus a bit as I see it, where I've moved through from just an introduction to the S&C to then being a national lead for the S&C for British swimming, and culminating with really a couple of attendances at Olympics or Olympic holding camps, looking after athletes that medaled, and dealing with everything that came with, and a national network as well. And then moving to Qatar, I think the big thing here is that Qatar loves to think big. They have the funding, the vision, and this allows certain things that maybe can't happen in the UK to happen quickly. We have maybe more scope and we can think a bit broader. So actually, interestingly, the staff here are probably very similar in terms of it's quite an institute style setup. So we have access to all the normal performance services and the coaching range that we would, probably broader than what I did before. And with that brings a multitude of coaches and head coaches, and very, very good individuals within the organization. Lots of staff, everything from biochemistry to performance analysis, biomechanics, S&C, physiology. I don't actually work with physiotherapy directly in terms of management, but they're obviously part of the process. But making sure all of those people and all those processes and teams are working well is essentially one of my roles, and that's a lot of plates to spin, and it's a lot of people to deal with, and obviously that comes with personal, professional considerations all the way along the line. So yeah, I think it's to some extent it's grown quite organically, but I think that's supported by characteristics and other things that we can probably talk about, which are probably shown within myself. So yeah, it's been a good journey to date, and I think it will continue.
No, that's good. And what do you think are some of the early challenges along that journey that have maybe shaped your leadership? Are you able to give any examples
Yeah.
or pick anything out?
Yeah, so I think probably the biggest thing was, I mean, I always felt like in Loughborough, I always did the job before I got the job, and I think that's probably quite typical. So I worked at I guess, an elite end within British swimming, and then probably had quite a large national influence prior to getting the national lead role. But once that was given and designated as officially that is your role, your national lead, then I had my own intensive training center to deal with, and there's three kind of high profile, strongly minded coaches there who all want service and on the ground, operationally speaking. But then there's intensive training centres in Scotland, Wales, and there's three in England as well, which also need some coordination, input, alignment of philosophy, new staff potentially need training and reaching out to, alongside just a sense of community and a culture that I would essentially be looking after their athletes on national holding camps, international holding camps in Sardinia or Japan or the US or wherever it might be. So that in itself brings a coordination element. You start to realize that actually I can be potentially try and be more collaborative on this front, and here I might have to be slightly more authoritarian to some extent. You have to connect very well with the coaches. It's something you would understand, obviously, given your background as well, because even though you don't see them day to day, to be effective and to lead and to affect that change in the holding camp scenarios or national camp scenarios, you need to have that connection and that understanding for the athlete, for the coach, and for the performance personnel. So that isn't an easy thing to do necessarily, and you test yourself as you try and implement different policies, or you try and get different programs or thought processes going. So that would be definitely one. And then in Aspire, there's been multiple cases where I've had to lead an endurance program. A short notice departure of a coach led me to be the lead coach for a period of time. That puts a different hat on, and you end up taking kids to training camps. I ran altitude studies, coordinated all the training and all the support staff around that for a year prior to the next coach coming in. So that again has, okay, this is now your baby, you run with it. It's not your field of expertise, but you have the qualities to make that successful as a program. And I believe it was so based on performances, but also in terms of where the boys went on to in terms of going to US colleges and actually running high performance times. And I think also probably the biggest and most recent one was Aspire Academy. Like, we shaped the department as it stands now from what it was 11 years ago when I first saw it, and obviously prior to that to how it is now, and how we operate is very, very different. And that's taken a lot of time, but a lot of careful thought about what is best practice for sports performance at a junior elite to senior kind of under 23s elite level. So, and that's, had its challenges for sure, but there's, again, multiple people, strong personalities, lots of thoughts about what is the best way. But myself and a colleague have essentially driven that process, and I believe we're in an excellent place right now.
That's great. No, thanks for sharing that. And you've covered quite a few things there. Clearly, you've developed a lot of skills, and you've had to have a broad skill set in those different settings in British swimming, and here in Aspire you've talked about dealing with strongly minded coaches, having the coordination element, having the connecting with different people element. In that kind of example of how you've sort of made an impact in Aspire, can you talk a little bit more about maybe how your leadership style or certain decisions you've made or systems or processes you put in place, or something about you as a leader that you feel has been a bit of a catalyst with making those changes or having an impact? Or have you got any examples?
Yeah, I can definitely think that what's driven me behind a lot of this is, I think I'm quite equitable as a character. I believe that people should be treated fairly, and I think that drives a lot of what I do. But very much on the other hand, I think I really love good performances. I want people to try and achieve their best performance, whatever that might be. And these couple of areas really drive me towards some of the decisions that we make. And anyone who's given a leadership position doesn't literally come in and be the best leader they're ever going to be. Like, you feel your way into that. So I think you grow, and you should expect to grow and develop as a character and as a leader, and you learn how to do certain things more or less effectively over time. And that's a normal expectation. So I think my style has probably become slightly more confident and more refined with different people. I've certainly noted, and it's probably no surprise, but the connection to the staff or the coaches has a huge bearing on your ability to influence positively in what might be the case, which really is underpinned by trust and understanding. So if they believe you're aligned to the right direction, and you spend time with their program, you spend time piste side and pool side and track side, whatever it might be, you have a connection, you understand, and you can shape what goes on, particularly within that program operationally.
Yeah.
But if you take a step back, and I think of some problems we've had here where, we have to implement structure. So we've implemented performance support leads, which are essentially sports science managers for each team. That's based on the qualities of that individual. And that's really to assist the coach in a more fluid and seamless acquisition of sports science resources. Otherwise, they're dealing with maybe 6 or 7 personnel, and that becomes too tricky. So we've put in some structures and processes to help that scenario, but at the same time, it's underpinned by this trust and familiarity with the programs and the coaches, which are, I mean, I don't think that's changed since I probably started in 2003 through to now. Same
Yeah,
principle throughout the whole process.
it's interesting because you often get leaders who are really, really good on the people side, but actually never really achieve anything and don't make an impact. And you spoke about how you kind of hold both those things in high importance, the people, but also you said you want to make an impact in performance because you love good performance. And you can get people who are really good at the performance side who just neglect the people, and they're not great leaders because they get outcomes, but the organization maybe falls apart and collapses because they're not good on the people side. Have you been quite intentional about marrying both those skills of, you mentioned you've implemented structure, so you're obviously good at implementing systems and processes, and you're very good on the structure side. How have you married the people side and the kind of the outcome structure side so well?
I think it goes hand in hand because to retain and to keep people on board, they're probably in the sport for a good reason anyway, good heart, good ambitions, and maybe they want to rise up the ranks as well. This is as staff, but they've also got personal considerations. They've got ambitions. They have probably financial requirements and needs that they feel like they should have progression. Their objectives, which typically, if you have a process in a company like we do here, where you are setting that and reviewing that yearly and then mid-yearly as well, they need to be aligned correctly. But beyond that, you can have an influence that is greater into the community, and also most performers that we work with won't be elite athletes, but they need to have a good experience, and I think that's really important. Given that point, underpinning that, there's HR processes that can support these individuals. There are considerations, especially when you look at the size of the corporate services in Aspire. Procurement, finance, marketing can all have an impact on the success of a program, camp delivery, its promotion within the community and internationally, its actual development in a performance standpoint. So whether it gets the best talent, whether it travels and experiences high levels of performance, which in turn drives the performance standards within that group. Everyone in this company, really, I mean, I think there's 1,400 within the zone. They're driven towards essentially supporting the athlete. So they are number one, they're up on the stage first, and everything else around that, including the person who stamps the finance paperwork, they are there for this individual. So you can't really separate anything. I always think everything is a downstream of a performance issue. And at different levels, it might be, okay, you want to achieve a pull-up RM or a squat RM of a certain value. But in some cases, it's, I don't have the funds for a camp, which I really need to go to, which changed my ranking points. And that has a financial planning implication, or I can't acquire the equipment, so that has a procurement implication. Or the coach is not spending enough time thinking about the sport and the athletes enough because they're having to deal with multiple personnel, because the structure is very plentiful with those types of people here, and also in the UKIS as well. So then you have to think of the system that supports that coach to remain focused on that key component of their job, which is performance and the training of those athletes, which we know leads to then performance down the line. So they are hand in hand entwined, and I would encourage my staff, certainly who want to rise up to a different level, is to have a very broad spectrum. And I think that's why it's useful to have management diplomas and MBAs potentially, because it opens your eyes to other aspects of the business, which could be exciting to go and seek employment in the future, but it also has a bearing on potentially the performance of you in your role right now. So, and that might be something you have to deal with in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you've talked about a broad range of skills and involvement, and the more I speak to leaders and in my own journey as a leader, I've noticed, there's a lot of juggling of balls. There's a lot of involvement in lots and lots of different areas. How do you manage to juggle all these areas, and what would you say are the kind of the unique challenges that you come across in the performance field, or have you got any specific examples where there's been some real challenges in this?
Yeah, I think that there are a few challenges. Certainly balancing those, juggling those balls. I think sometimes you have to take blocks of time, and I don't really, block out time in my calendar, but you do have to be focused and address certain issues as much as you can and prioritize those key issues at a given time. So that really matters. But then in the back of your head, you might have another project or another scenario that needs addressing, but it can wait 10 days, 2 weeks, whatever it is. So there's always that sectioning and prioritization in my head of what needs to be done. I think some unique issues are getting to that mindset. Often we're driven up through technical excellence. So you're a good S&C coach. You can influence and connect with the athletes, the swimmers, the track and field athletes, whatever it might be. Now you can have a lead role. Okay, now you've got the lead role. We're going to give you a slightly bigger lead role. And unless you stop and, as an organization or as an individual, train and prepare for that scenario, then I think you can become quite ineffective at understanding and managing that situation where you've got multiple staff and you maybe don't know how to manage and lead within that scenario. So again, maybe you're a fish out of water. You should be the technical staff member. You want to be in that lead role, but you haven't been given the tools to manage it. And I think I've seen that multiple times with, in the UKIS, coaches coming in from club setups with big support networks. I've seen that here where coaches have done everything in their prior roles, literally, driving the bus to, throwing the discus. But then they come here and they have a full team around them, and how to use that effectively, which essentially is our USP to some extent, is not easy. And they need support in doing that. So that is not a new, but I think it's quite a unique challenge to get right and to guide people through. So, and alongside that, we have an extensive data analytics, sport analytics team that's clearly growing in sport right now. So with wearables, with all the information that coaches want, that's adding an additional layer of complexity, which, say, I think coaches might have the ambition to tap into, to understand, but again, guiding that in an acute and effective way would take a special relationship and a special guidance process within an organization. Typically, we would come from performance problems and performance questions. But yeah, I think there's multiple areas, and typically it comes from the complexity of more staff and more data and more information. And over 20 years, I haven't always seen it being done well, but I definitely see it probably being done better here than in most places.
No, that's great. I'm scribbling stuff down as you talk, but you've talked about how people kind of maybe come from a practitioner background and they move up the ranks to a head of department or a head of their discipline or whatever that might be, but they're not always prepared for it. What have you done yourself to kind of upskill throughout your journey as a leader? What have you read? Who do you look to? What courses might you have done? How have you educated yourself? Can you shed some insights into that?
Yeah, sure. I think there's a few areas you can dip into, and one is more academic. So, very early on, I was just reading about certain things. I would go on Coursera and take a course, or I would then, I've got a diploma in sports management from SDA Bocconi, which was great, really good content. But then, okay, now I want to signpost my direction a bit more. So then I took an MBA. I'm very unlikely to take a PhD, but I would be more interested in taking an MBA just to, again, broaden that understanding and be competent as a leader. So I think that's great, but I've also reached out to individuals and said, right, how am I perceived? How am I doing? What do you do within your day as a director, as a lead? How do you behave? How do you structure your calendar? You have an open door policy, a closed door policy. It's interesting to see what different people do. And this is one of the things I know, I don't really have a pin-up of the leadership world in my mind. I see different people and I see what they do or what they don't do, and I think, okay, that's for that situation, that's really good. So I look at British swimming from say 99 to 2000 was probably not overly successful, but then in comes the performance director. He creates a strong cultural change, and then behind him, the performance director creates a strategic plan which is across the UK. And behind him, it's a coach which is stepping up, and then it's a slightly more scaled back strategic approach, but it's including the clubs a bit more. Neither is good or bad necessarily, but they are right for the given time. And I think if you look at the CEO, they may have a clear direction about what needs to be done at certain times. You know, I look at people within my organization, and I think I like that. That worked well in that situation. That created the change we needed, or solved the problem where people weren't being listened to, or something needed to happen. You sort of note that down and put that in the back of your head for the future. There are so many different scenarios, but yeah, I mean, look, there's great meta-analysis on factors affecting performance teams. There's people like Tina Murray, for example, who would be really good on multidisciplinary teams and working through high performance solutions, but in a way that's not, should we say, detrimental to the human being, but actually in a emotionally safe, progressive, performance focused manner. I think this is really important. So there are lots of different people at lots of different levels for lots of different solutions, and fundamentally behind all of this, I believe we can all lead at our given level. So a coach can lead very well in the gym or on the track, but you know, our director general is very, very good with, you know, the political connections. He's very good at public speaking. You know, this is another quality and skill set. He has a bit more quiet charisma. So I always think you seek input, you watch people, you be the observer, you ask questions and be somewhat humble in your journey upwards. And you know, if you can make some notes and think about how you would shape that problem for yourself in the future, then that's a good way to go.
That's good. I mean, clearly, as you've worked through your career and you've moved up the ranks, you've not just kind of landed on your feet. It doesn't strike me that this has kind of just been, you know, right place, right time. You've been quite intentional on upskilling yourself. You've done courses, you've done your diploma, you've done an MBA, you have clearly gleaned off other people by just observing them and watching and asking questions. So you've obviously worked hard at upskilling yourself, and that's been very effective for you. And it's good for our listeners to know that, you know, there's a lot that we can do ourselves as leaders to get better and you know, be intentional about improving. Is there anything you've kind of seen along your journey with working with other people or observing people that you've gone, I don't want to be like that as a leader, or that's something I definitely won't adopt into my own style?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen behaviors, and you know, to talk about these things is sometimes tricky, but things that have happened to me where, you know, let's just say post Olympics, everyone's pretty much put a lot of work into this process, and it's you know, okay, it's 4 years, but it's very intense for 6 months, and essentially the first meeting after the Olympics pulled together and then sat down and told that, you know, we need more, it's not good enough, and we need to up the game, and you've got to cut this out and you've got to add this in. You know, people left the meeting in tears, and I think, wow, that's a hell of a way of you know, brandishing the stick. And I don't think it's wrong to brandish the stick sometimes, you know, to say, look, this is the standard, this is where we need to get to, but there's a time and a place. And I think that lacked emotional intelligence. So this kind of must permeate your process throughout the whole situation. You know, I've seen people probably treat unfairly, and I think one thing that I would always do is, even if something is not done well, I would always approach the individual. And even this happens today, where I think, okay, I know your ambition as an individual. I think you not coming to this event, this scenario, would probably be you know, if you've missed out on something here. I think, view it this way, you should see this as an opportunity to broaden your scope to then move up in the future. I've been asked this before, what do you do if you're telling someone off? And I think, well, we need to correct them. If you understand that individual and understand their ambitions, like you can always frame it against that. Okay, I think the
Mhm.
behaviors here were a bit substandard to where you want to go, let alone what we want as an organization. So you may be on a performance improvement plan because of it, but it's positively orientated to making you better. Of course, there are scenarios where people have been released from roles, and I've had the non-pleasure of doing that myself. I've always been comfortable with doing it against the standards of what we expect as an organization. And I actually think it doesn't leave a bad echo within the room of actually this is the standard we need to be at.
Mhm.
I think there's a flip side to both, and we can't always say it's roses and people don't get removed for underperformance. But I would again do it in a very, I think, fair, equitable way with lots of information up front and dialogue. I think that's often the way to go. Whereas, without saying too many things, I think I've seen that before where it's not been done in such a way where people have been removed from programs unfairly and without disclosure. And I think very easily could have been fixed with disclosure and openness, which
Yeah.
probably just garners further trust. So, yeah, I've seen a lot of things which I probably think I wouldn't do that, but it's a bit like a kid growing up. You look at your parents and go, I wouldn't do that. Some you would, some you wouldn't, until you know you're in that situation. But I've not come across a situation where I think, been unduly wrong in my decision making, and I think there's always rationality and compassion behind it.
Yeah. No, that's good. And I think there's some of your core values are really coming out there when you talk about being fair and equitable, and the fact that you use emotional intelligence and you want to understand the person and their goals and objectives, because then you can frame things towards that when you have to correct people or redirect people. And you've obviously got this balance of really understanding the people and treating them fairly, but not being scared to have the difficult conversation when it's necessary. What other sort of core values do you have that are really important to you as a leader that you want to act and behave and be like that as a leader?
Yeah, I think it's important to be a transformational leader in the sense that you need to have a bigger purpose, and I think with people would term it as like a pace setting type leader. So I need to be that person that people look at and go, yeah, he's not afraid to do X, or he's willing to do the hours, he's willing to generate the level of work. So I think that's a really important aspect where I am that standard within the organization. And, I think other people can be held to that because I can hold myself to it as well. I like to be, if we're talking about qualities of the leadership, people first, connection, but always with a performance orientation. And to some extent, if you've got good staff, you can operate in a more of a servant way. So you are smoothing the path for them to do a great job. Democratic, like I have an idea, this is my proposal, but I seek your input on this because I value you as an employee. That's really important. And that's good for them. It's good for the proposal, and people should be consulted because, yeah, you're employing them, you're paying them, and they might have really useful insights. And you don't have to adopt their insights, but it's good to have it.
Yeah.
Ethical, I've already talked about to some extent, and pace setting and transformational, I think is important. Like we have a slightly larger purpose, and I think one of those things I say with the transformational is that not everyone's going to be performance level athletes. We're dealing with juniors here, typically some seniors. So what happens to the juniors that don't make it, who aren't selected, who then just go to the police or the army or to work in the community? Like we want them to have a positive relationship with sport for the rest of their life, and that's what I want, and that has a bearing on the country's health, the country's approach to sport in the future. They have their own families, and that has a bearing down generations, which is beyond me when I leave, whenever I leave. That has a positive influence on the country, and I genuinely believe that's actually the reason why I can work with the 90% that won't make it and the 10% that will. I can justify both sides of that, and I like to convey that if I can to the team where possible. although our central mandate is performance.
It's so good to hear that you've you're much broader than just kind of performance outcomes. That you even spoke about, having a positive impact on the country, and that's great that you take that responsibility so seriously. And I've not really heard people speak like that often. And when you do, it makes you realize that you've got a real big picture view of what you're doing, as well as I'm sure you're into the detail and you understand that side as well. But to have that broad perspective is fantastic. I just want to kind of shift focus a little bit and talk to you about some of the frameworks or models or inspirations that you might have in leadership. Like, have you got any like rules of thumb that you use, or is there a certain model that either you've developed or that you've read in the research or you've learnt on your MBA, or something that you go, yeah, I like to operate by this, or I find this a helpful framework? Or have you got anything like that you can share with us?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's loads and loads of models, and leadership is a very extensive area full of ideas and models. And I think simplicity is a good way to go here. So when I think of people leading at multi levels, I think you have to lead with yourself first. So you lead me, and then if I'm fortunate enough to be in a position where I have athletes or I have a one direct report, I can lead you. That might be the athletes, that might be the direct report, whatever that is. And then organizationally speaking, you can lead us. So you kind of have at the core yourself, how you lead yourself, your professional behaviors, if you will, your knowledge acquisition, your relationships. Extending out, you lead the immediate team that you have. Depending on your scenario, that could be different. It could be my staff and also the athletes that I see, the coaches that I work with. And then leading us is the organization. And that could be very broad like it is here in Qatar, or it could be quite tight in my prior roles. I think that's a good way to view things. And it's about understanding who you are as in the core as a person, but a person within the organization. So understanding your job description, what you do, how you influence. But then your team, how they grow, how safe they feel, how the knowledge is shared, their continual improvement, employment and management of that, getting the right people on the bus. And then the organization is about problems, policies, procedures, the culture, facility development, operations, finance, things that I've mentioned before. And certainly been here, I've had an influence across departmental structures, which ours is actually quite flat, which has pros and cons, but we see it more beneficial than not. So I think that's a really good, you could think of it as a concentric circles going out. The other aspect is, there's loads and loads of leadership styles, and I use the acronym just ADEPT, and ADEPT is just being highly skilled and proficient at something. And these are things I've talked about before, but I think affiliative leadership, so there's connection with people, which is solution focused, democratic, ethical, pace setting, and transformational. I think those are areas where, okay, you could go broader, but those are things I like to think about and I believe are important to consider. Those are probably more on the leadership style. Something within the MBA that popped up, and they talk a lot about change management. I see a lot of issues that could be solved through better communication and better structure of an operational process. So someone comes to me and says, I have a concern about X, Y, and Z, and this didn't happen. And I said, have you spoken to the individual? And I understand that takes an element of bravery, which I think is not easy for a lot of people. Like, you can have a 45-year-old man who just doesn't want to talk to the junior coach about something, or another member of staff in another team. So encouraging that dialogue, and I would even encourage my staff to go and, where appropriate, talk to the director of sport and strategy and express how they feel, because it may be the first time they've connected with him. And I think it's useful, not all the time, because you don't want to bury him in smaller information, but when it's important, I think that communication prompt is really useful. But alongside the same line is a acronym RACI. So if you're implementing something, who's responsible, who's accountable? So it might be a facility development. I might be responsible. I might make one of my coaches accountable for the actual planning of it. Who should be consulted? I'm pretty sure you're talking to equipment manufacturers, structural engineers, facility operations within the building, and who should be informed. So maybe once it's done, some of the coaches are informed that we have a new facility. Maybe they're consulted as well, but having a loose structure, at least before you start doing something relatively significant and could have an impact on others, is to say, what are those 4 areas? Who are those people within those 4 areas? And I guess between those 3 things, I mean, I would pull out probably more, but I think they're quite useful if people think about that going forwards. And what you can do is you can shape leadership behaviors. You can consider at what level you lead. And you may not have any influence on leading the organization early on, but you may better just lead yourself very, very well. And also then it's the communication and responsibility aspect, I think, is important.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks a lot for sharing them. It's interesting because I sometimes speak to people and they rattle off a model or an acronym, and it doesn't mean very much, or it feels a bit cliched. But when you talk about these models that you align to and that you work according to, and that you use as a rule of thumb or just as a bit of a checklist for yourself, it very much comes to life because you're speaking from experience. When you were talking about adept and you're talking about pace setting, transformational earlier, you've already been speaking about those areas of being really important to you. So I'm like, okay, so this is where it all fits together. So it's great to hear that you've taken these models and it's not just an academic process you're going through. You're actually living it and applying it. I would like to just push you on a few areas because I've talked a lot to other leaders on other podcasts about some of these areas, but a couple of things that I've not really pushed people on and I'd like to hear a bit more on is the pace setting and the transformational. So what does that mean to you, the pace setting side and then going on to be transformational? Can you unpack those two a little bit?
Yeah, so I think pace setting for me is kind of do as I do. So if someone comes in the company and or is transitioned between another team, it's like, okay, this is how we do things within the physical services team or within the performance team. And we're quite a large footprint of a building, for example. So one simple thing might be, right, we need to be present within the office so that we actually connect on a regular basis. We need to have projects that we're pushing on. So whether we're looking at ground reaction forces and running across different speeds and surfaces, or we're looking at some fencing endurance program or something else like this, there needs to be some further investigation going on with your life. And I can talk about what I'm doing currently within paddle, and they need to better talk about what they're doing. And if they're not, they need to be guided to that point where there is further inquiry, where we are developing intellectual property and our unique knowledge that's sitting within our building. Some of it's promoted, some of it's not. It's used to our advantage. So I think there's an element of that, and it can go from the details of picking up a water bottle and making the training environment really nice for the athletes, to developing facilities and a bit more grandiose, or policies and procedures or projects. Like I'm happy to address all of those things. I would quite happily coach a 12-year-old through a back squat, and I would also write a document which would be a MOU, memorandum of understanding for a federation, probably in the same day. So I think those things don't often happen, right? But I'm willing to do that, and I don't think anyone could say, yeah, he's kind of moved up the ranks, he's been a bit lucky, not really maybe capitalized on the luck, and he's just sat back on his laurels. I wouldn't want to set that trend at all. Also to focus people and use people within the team to guide them always towards the performance improvement and the performance question. So for me, that's how I kind of view the pace setting. It's very much a modeling of things I do and things that are done within the team. So it's not always me, but there's other individuals within the team that certainly would be high up on the modeling front as well.
Yeah,
and
sorry
sorry, go on.
sorry to interrupt you, but so it's kind of like a modeling and it's an expectation setting of this is how we operate, this is how we expect you to operate, this is how I do it, and so on. So That's clear, and I like the way you've expressed that and brought in a few different elements. What about the transformational side? You were about to start before I interrupted you.
Yeah, so I think it's, I probably didn't think about this when I started early on because, as you get older, maybe you get a bit wiser, or like I say, with Qatar, you can see the impact of what you do, maybe broader than the athletes in front of you. So I think there's an element of your impact can be greater than what you perceive it to be. And to some extent, it's my role to make you see that. Might not be our core value, but we've got coaches here who are heads of the federation and head coaches within the academy. So they have a broad role in terms of actually influencing that sport across the nation. And if you're in that program, you also then have an impact across it too. So, and you're dealing with soft power politics here. We're dealing with people putting money into sport and having an influence with huge marketing and influential potential. We have Mutaz Barsham. He's come through the academy. He's got 3 Olympic medals, and he's absolutely a great character and a great role model. And so the people who have been involved in that process, some of them are still here, some of them are gone, but they must realize what a transformational impact that could have had to multiple people, especially when he's still around the building. So I think it's a nice example through an individual of how we can be bigger than what we necessarily do right now. And I can also say, with regards to, say, my wife working in in large major events, like those events have huge footprints, historically speaking, but also across the community. So what they do with the personnel and the volunteers and the workforce is really impactful, and it makes stories go around the world, which in most cases are very positive. So, I think sport performance is important, but you can have a really positive impact beyond and into the community. And we're still young in the mindset of performance sport in this country, although we do okay. But the parents and the grandparents don't really understand performance sport in all cases, and it's a bit different to the UK, but that's all right.
Yeah, no, I mean it's definitely a different setting, but you're still making an impact, and you're kind of a lot of the things that you're experiencing and doing have never been done before. In fact, most of them in that setting, and so it must feel like a real privilege to be doing something new and making an impact in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also we're doing things that haven't been done before, I think in some cases globally. So,
Yeah,
Qatar is small and it's well mobilized and it's well supported, and we are well supported here. And yeah, we do things that are new for the country, and in some cases we do things that are new for the world of sport. And I think it's a great combination because, if you think of again that leadership impact, for sure the leadership within the country have big visions. I can't influence that, but I can support downstream of those things, and that's what we do. So it's great to
yeah.
be part of.
No, I mean you're right. The global impact of the work you're doing is incredible. And I was at a conference just this week actually in Germany, and there were people who'd been at Aspire at the conference. And so, that, and the number of times I've heard people from your organization presenting in different places. So you're absolutely right. The global impact is huge. Just while we're on this kind of, we were talking about frameworks and models, and we've gone a bit deeper into them. Um, in that vein, is there any work that you've read that you've been particularly impacted by, or a particular leadership figure that you look up to, or any books that you've read? Like where else are your kind of inspirations and influences from personally as a leader?
Yeah, so I mean, look, I'll get insights from Ergon Zender, which is a leadership consultancy firm. Harvard Business Review I'll read, but again, you would have to typically extrapolate. There's obviously podcasts that you'll drop into, and you'll sort of connect the dots between one thing and another. Daily updates of how to manage better from Harvard Business Review. Some of them are relevant, some of them aren't. You have to see different things, and then there's individuals like there's a chap called Ben Salsinovich within the company that has done a meta-analysis on basically factors influencing team performance. And he identifies 4 key areas, and that's a meta-analysis. So it's 46 articles. It's always nice to have a meta-analysis to save you the work, right? But team leadership is a big aspect. So that's, if I look at myself, they refer to cognition, conscientiousness, and charisma. Now, I see a lot of charismatic people, but I also think there's a lot of coaches with the smarts. They have to be clever, finger on the pulse. You look at a lot of the F1 team bosses, they're not too far away. And I think it's been said before by, our funny man Gunther, but he said something along the lines of he probably wasn't too far away from being able to do 80% of every single role in the team. Okay, the extra 20% matters, but he clearly has really good technical expertise and cognition. So, and the conscientiousness that comes with being that leader as well, and then caring for the people. So again, picking up Ben's article, but having the performance goals and feedback within the team. So that's the support network and the driving forward of knowledge, the setting of standards and behaviors. That's always really important. Working together. So something that is probably more challenging here is we have silos. So how to share that knowledge across the silos of the sports, which can be quite extensive, but how do we share problems? How do we address things across the organization, which is not small, and there's lots of moving parts, and geographically it's a bit split sometimes. And also the impact and the structure of your team within the organization. So the UKIS is going to be different to Aspire Academy. It's going to be different to the Sacramento Kings in the US. They operate in a different structure, and they need to do so to be successful for where they are. So there is no clear answer about what is right or wrong, but it's contextually specific for the given scenario. So if I have to pick on one, I think Ben's article is very, very good, and there are many, many more that you could probably dip into, but having that continual drip feeding is quite handy. MBA, yeah, it's okay, but again, you do a lot of reading about external and internal and external influences. So you're talking about your PESTEL analysis or your SWOT or SOAR analysis, and you talk about managing change, lots and lots of different processes that you can talk about and models. Typically you'll forget, and then when a scenario arises, you might need to just quickly refresh about, okay, how should I best approach this? This is probably quite typical. Knowledge is never too far away, and if you know how to access it quite quickly, that's always useful. I tend not to dip into the books and say that's the book I like, so I'm always a bit cautious about saying that, but there's definitely a lot of good books out there. But again, leadership is probably one of those the most prevalently written about areas ever, really. I mean, they have so many books about management and leadership, it's incredible. So, and I'm not sure how many sports leaders and managers will read many of those books, possibly so. But I think a lot of people arrive into position and are happy to take that without further upskilling and consultation.
I think you're right. There's so much on leadership, and it's an area that some people are like, it's just completely overdone. There's too much information. Yeah, I see in sport, there's so many leaders who aren't putting this knowledge and these behaviors into practice, and these values,
Yeah.
they don't hold those values. So I'm like, well, yeah, there might be a lot of information, but how about reading it and putting it into practice? But one thing you said really stood out, and you said the continually drip feeding. And I think that's something I've noticed with a lot of leaders. And you've said this is one thing you do, you just, daily emails or, continually drip feeding. I think good leaders have habits of continually drip feeding themselves with good information, whether they have to adapt that to their situation or not. The fact that you're continually taking on stuff is a really good sign, and something that I've noticed in a lot of people. Just to kind of begin looking forward as we wrap up, are there any kind of evolving trends in sports leadership, or is there any particular direction you see things going in the future, or any advice you would give to somebody who's kind of getting into sports leadership?
Yeah, I think it's quite hard, probably in my position, because I don't necessarily see the recruitment of sport leaders and managers. So, I mean, I think it's probably someone better. And I saw an article by a large report by Ergon Zender looking at that and having the recommendations of how to recruit the best leaders in the future. But that's not my bag necessarily. So to say I think it's going this way or that, it's a bit of a punt. I do think, and I completely agree with what you said before, and doing the basics really well. So what is known already within leadership, you see it again and again. Sports leaders come through and they are not necessarily prepared or trained or supported, or they don't have counsel to address certain situations. So I think that is a large area where, whether it's part of the onboarding process or whether it's part of the recruitment process, or it's a kind of a Kaizen, like continual improvement aspect within a company, it's super important. And doing that well can lead to a better process. Having said that, I do think that, and I talk about advice for future leaders, you need to be in contact and technically proficient. I think it definitely helps. If you put me in charge of, I don't know, an organization that deals with IT finance in a large organization, maybe I'm a great manager, but I'm really going to struggle technically. And I think maybe that's a bit far removed, but to put someone in a very high level leadership role in a governing body, it really helps to have the lingo and the trust and the knowledge on the ground. I'm not saying you have to come from being a club coach up and up and up. That's a great story, but for people who are aspiring, get close, be curious, learn, be humble, ask questions, and even now, I probably feel like I ask maybe too many questions sometimes, and I have to be conscious it doesn't undermine actually what I feel and what I know, because that can always give an impression. But you definitely should be curious and you should be learning. And that evolution of you and the broadening of your experiences can really put you in stead for the next role. Connection also helps. So reaching out to people, becoming a trusted individual, they can sponsor you into roles. They can give you a good reference. You become a known individual. They know you can do a good job. That's always excellent. So having the finger on the pulse of sport and having some face validity in that sport is really important. And the absolute basics. One of our recruitment kind of standards is just be a good guy or girl, be a good person, be approachable, be honest. You should better take criticism with some humble aspects, and consistency in behavior. So if you say hello one day to somebody and you don't say the next, that's a bit inconsistent. Like, we need to be, as a minimum standard, better than that. I will always generally treat people pretty equally, and okay, there's always pressure points, but I'm a pretty even-keeled individual, I think is the term that's been used. So, but yeah, and on top of that, I think there's aspects where you can think of yourself as multiple hats. You can be the dreamer, you can be the thinker, you should be the passionate person, and then you should also have the warrior, where you fight for what you believe, or you have a very strong standpoint to either protect what you have. I mean, that's not my work there, but that's from a lady called Erica Fox, who's from Harvard Law School. But what you have there is the different aspects of, okay, what am I doing now? What is this hat I'm wearing right now? Am I passionately defending something, but I've not thought about it? Should I seek more counsel and input? But a big thing here, and we saw it the other day with the 20th celebration for Aspire Academy, is that the director for football performance stood up and said, basically, he decided to dream a lot bigger for his department. And that was many, many years ago. So instead of sticking with smaller plans, I got the impression he just went big. He went for a high level of ambition, laid out big projects, and pretty much has executed that. But behind that, I can see that there's detail, there's fast action, there's support network. He's clearly probably very passionate about the project, and he has very good connections to the political people within the organizations and across the country. So I think all those things go into the mix. But yeah, I mean, be a good person, be curious and learn, observe is always good. And where you are right now is not a good marker of where you're going to be in the future. So just because you are doing whatever now, it doesn't mean that you can't be something else in the future. So relying on your current performance or your prior experience and trying to overlay that to your future potential, I would probably try and steer younger leaders away from that. Be more positive, be more proactive with some of these approaches to their ambitions. So you want to be X, okay, how are we going to get to X? It's not always easy, right? Because there's not many top positions that people really want. But I can probably say that once you get to that position that you think was the position you wanted, you probably want the next one already. So it never stops. At some point you have to say, okay, halas, enough. But yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great, Barry. I really, really want to say a big thank you to you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your experiences and your wisdom. And I think, and that was, ending on that was really positive, where you said, where you are now isn't always a good marker of where you're going to be in the future. I think that's something really good to remember and can be a real motivator for people and help people see a bit more positively. So just want to thank you. Is there anything you just want to add in closing? Anything that you want to say? It's just been great having you on, so just really grateful.
Yeah, look, I think in essence, we're in sport because it has a really positive impact on people's lives. I think you can be that person to your peers. You can be that person to the athletes and the parents and the coaches, and that's really a standpoint whether we're chasing performance or not. And that really matters. That really permeates. But there can also be a very hard element to changing systems. But essentially, be that core person, be that good character, and make a difference. And I think that will go a long way. People will see genuineness and they will trust you within that process. And for me, that's a great place to start. Then you can overlay frameworks and knowledge and connections on top of these things. But yeah, I think we're in a great industry. I wouldn't change it. Someone said to me, I'm in a job for life. I'm not sure I'm in the job for life, but I'm definitely in an industry for life, because I believe in the positive power of sport that we have. So, and like I say, I love performance. I love seeing things being done at the best possible level. It's very satisfying. There's beauty in that. And there's also a huge positive aspect to all the bits below that as well. So, yeah, I think we're lucky to be in a good place, and we should appreciate that to some extent.
Fantastic. It's so good to be reminded that we are in a good industry, and good to hear that you're so passionate about it, and you're not trying to get out, but you really love being there and love making an impact. So again, big thank you from me. Really looking forward to seeing you again face to face, Barry. And yeah, thanks for coming on the show.